In this week's video, I'm throwing another large vase for an exhibition later this year. So, I'll run you through the process of how I centre larger amounts of clay, how I open up that centred mass, and finally how I pull the walls up. I'll also be using a new tool which has been so helpful for throwing larger pots, and it's something so simple, but more on that in a little while. Of course, the first step of this process, as always, is wedging the clay, and this step of preparing the stoneware becomes even more vitally important when you're throwing larger pieces, as any air pocket left inside this mass or inconsistency in texture can really interfere as you're trying to lift the clay up. This process of hand wedging the clay moves the material in a spiral that gets ever smaller and smaller, and as it does, the clay is stretched and any air pockets inside should hopefully be popped. To finish off the wedging, I change my hand position slightly and I fold the clay in such a way that no air is trapped and a nice rounded bottom is formed on the base of the piece. With a rounded base, when I slam this massive clay onto the wheelhead, it won't trap any air underneath it. And I think much of the success of throwing larger pots has to do with your preparation. So let's get this onto the wheel. Using the circular lines scored into the metal wheelhead, I firmly chuck the lump of clay downward, sticking it to the metal. If it isn't centered, you can push it towards the middle, and then I spend some time pressing the clay in, and I run my finger over the base to seal it against the metal. And if any clay comes off of my fingers, I simply add it back to the top. If you find centering larger masses of clay like this difficult, especially if your clay is on the firmer side, you can do quite a lot of the centering with just a dry hand. I hold the wrist of my right hand to stabilise it, and then firmly push it into the massive clay and run it up from bottom to top. Any undulating piece of clay will be scraped off by my hand, and then I simply add that back to the top of the lump of clay. I'm now doing the same thing with my finger, but pushing it down, to remove clay that's wobbling as it spins. Essentially, all I'm doing here is getting the piece of clay as centered as it can be before I begin centering with water and really working it. And then, when I add water, as the lump of clay has already been centered quite well, I'm mainly focusing on coning the clay up and down, as opposed to really centering it like I might do otherwise. It's worth noting too that the clay I'm using in this video is quite firm, a bit too firm in fact, and if it was softer, I may not do the dry centering like I did previously. I then spend some time coning the clay up and down. To do this, I tuck my elbows into my waist, leaning my upper body weight onto them to keep my arms steady as I force the clay up. I then lean the clay over slightly and push it back down. If you don't lean it over to one side, as you push down, the clay will bulge up in your hands, and the process of simply pushing the clay back down will be much more difficult. Whereas if you lean the lump of clay over, as you press it down, it gathers in the bottom of the lump of clay, where it's easier to control. Once coned 2 or 3 times, I'll begin pressing the lump of clay down to form a thick disc, which I'll centre to the best of my abilities, as really this is the foundation for the rest of the pot. And if your piece of clay is wobbling or undulating as it spins before you open it out and then pull up the walls, then it'll be practically impossible to throw a successful pot. With the lump of clay centered, I then plunge my index finger and thumb into the middle of the mass. And as soon as I feel like there's any friction whatsoever, I immediately fill this well with water, as if you try and do this step with the clay dry, then the stoneware will just stick to your hand and the whole lump of clay will be drawn off center. As with firm clay like this, I really had to push down with quite a lot of pressure. And once I've pushed down, I can then glide my hands horizontally across the base, forming the internal floor of the pot. And if I feel like I haven't gone deep enough, I simply push my fingers into the middle and drag that clay out again. And like I said, as soon as it feels dry, add some more water or slip, as this really helps the clay to move smoothly. And ideally, I want the base to be about 1 centimetre thick, and I do this by comparing the level of the wheel head to the level of the floor of the pot. But you can equally just pierce the base with a potter's needle until it touches the metal, and once removed you should be able to easily see how thick it is. With the base finished, I clasp the outer walls with wetted hands as tightly as possible to make sure they're really centered, and then from the outside I collar these walls inward. This thins out what was a very thick expanse of clay, and one that would have been very difficult to pull properly straight away. It's for that same reason that I do a few heel lifts too. This is when I use my left hand to essentially scoop the clay up. I begin by pushing it in at the base, whilst on the inside I push out with my right hand. It's more or less the exact same procedure as when you pull up with a knuckle on the outside. Yet, by using the heel of your hand, you apply pressure to a much greater surface area, and it makes shifting up these thicker walls of clay just a bit easier, especially for the first few lifts of clay. I recently purchased some MUDTOOLS throwing sponges, as for the longest time, when throwing larger pots and using a sponge on the outside to lift up with, I've just used a scrap of sponge, cut from a larger one. They disintegrate quickly, whereas these are much finer, and it should help me pull the walls up more easily. Like using the heel of my palm, a sponge like this sort of distributes the pressure being applied to the outside wall, and it generally just makes for a smoother experience of lifting the clay up, as compared to just using the side of my knuckle, which can be quite a harsh point of contact. The sponge can also be soaked before each pull, which means as you press it against the wall of the pot, it gradually leaks water and keeps the outer wall lubricated, which, once again, is important, as if the wall of the pot becomes too dry or your hand becomes too dry, the two parts will stick together and the entire pot will be drawn off center and twisted, which can cause the pot to buckle and collapse. Throughout this segment of the video, where I'm pulling the walls up, you'll notice just how slowly I'm moving my hands. From the moment they pinch in at the bottom and lift the clay up, I move them at a consistent pace from bottom to top, and between pulls I'll collar the walls in like so, just to keep the shape under control and to keep it from splaying out too much. At the beginning of the pull, I push some of the excess clay around the base into the bottom portion of the pot. This creates a bulge of clay, and from the inside, my wetted fingertips are pushing out where that bump is, whereas with the sponge on the outside, I'm just underneath that bump, lifting it up in a very even, steady motion, and as my hands travel up the walls of the pot, they remain in the same relative position, almost extruding the clay through a smaller gap in my hands, which thins out the walls of the pot with each consecutive pull. If you suddenly change the position of your hands, or increase the speed of the wheel, or slow it down drastically, the clay will flow through your fingers at a different rate, and you'll create unevenness in the walls. And when I finally reach the top of the pot, I don't throw through the rim and create a very thin, weak top. I instead leave it relatively thick, so there's material I can use later on to finish the top to my liking. And all the collaring in you just saw me do was to make the cylinder straighter, as I find it a bit easier to pull the walls up and gain height when the pot's walls are straight as compared to being bellied out. If you find you have to change position as you're pulling the walls up, that's perfectly fine to do, but you have to let go of the piece gently, as if you suddenly release your grip as you're throwing and move your hands away from the vessel quickly, breaking contact, you'll impart an undulation on the pot. So whenever you place your hands onto the piece and whenever you release them, it needs to be done in a gentle way. At this point, I felt like the walls were pretty even from top to bottom, as well as being thin enough. So from now on, with each pull, I'm not focusing on gaining height, rather my focus is on gaining the shape I want. So I begin to slowly belly the form out, which I do by pushing the walls out from the inside. And with the sponge on my right hand, I'm bracing that outward pressure and guiding the shape. I'm throwing a simple angular form, a vase, which you've likely already seen me throw a smaller version of in the past. If you look towards the bottom of the pot, you can see that there are very faint twists that spiral around as the pot spins, so I need to be careful not to exert too much pressure on the top, as if I don't deal with those quickly, they could become a problem later on. So I very carefully go over this area, pushing the walls out against the sponge and evening out any inconsistencies I can feel. And it's at this stage that I begin making the pot far more angular and in line with the general aesthetic of the rest of my work. And as I slowly coax the pot into the correct shape, you can see that I'm still stabilising my right arm by tucking it into my waist. So much of learning to throw is learning to keep your arms and hands stable in certain positions, be it stationary when centering, or stable even when they're moving up the walls of the pot like this. Like anything, it all takes practice. And as a potter who hasn't made many large pots in his life, I'm still learning a lot whenever I make bigger pieces. And it's glazing large pots like this which I find a real struggle, as generally I've been dipping the entire pots into a bucket of glaze and I let the displacement of the glaze itself move up and coat the exterior walls, and then a few days later I pour a few jugs worth of glaze inside the pot and then swirl it around and pour it out so that it leaves a nice even layer. The problem is, this of course becomes more and more difficult as the pots get larger, as I need increasingly large buckets of glaze, and generally as I want a clean, even surface covering the pot. If I make even one mistake on what is essentially one large canvas, it becomes incredibly obvious. So I'm still figuring out the best way of doing this, yet I'm still enjoying it thoroughly, even if not every pot is a success. With the shape of the pot more or less to my liking, I can begin to scrape clean the walls of the pot, which refines the shape and takes away this slip that covers the surface. I gave the walls a quick blast with the heat gun so that when I scrape the slip of this upper section of the pot, where the walls are really quite thin, the angled waist section doesn't bow out more than it should. Essentially, it just stiffens everything up slightly and helps the pot retain its shape as other parts of it are thrown. As for the rim of the pot, I just want it to angle upwards and come to a relatively fine point. But much of that further refinement I'll do to this piece once it's leather hard, in a few days' time, and the pot will get to that stage quicker if I remove much of the slip from the outer walls and leave the pot as dry, relatively, as it can be. I then use the flat side of a rubber kidney just to scrape away the throwing lines on certain parts of the pot. This way my glaze will sit on those sections a bit more neatly. I then use a chamois leather to compress and soften the rim, and finally scrape away some of the excess clay from around the base, which yes, I could have incorporated into the pot to throw it a bit taller, but I didn't. And all these scraps which I'm removing are chucked back into a bag of clay and they can immediately be wedged up and thrown into something new. I spend a few moments tidying up this section of the pot and that's the vase complete. For now at least. It's not giant and it comes in at just under 40 centimeters. And before being able to lift this piece away from the wheel, I'll quickly dry out this lower portion a little. This way, when I place my hands around the pot and lift it away, I don't deform the thin walls. I carefully remove any excess water from inside, making sure I don't knock into the rim of the vase. A taut wire is then dragged beneath the pot, and then I lightly clasp the tacky clay and lift the pot away. And I'm really not squeezing in, rather my hands are making contact all the way around and then they lift away. I hope you found this video useful. Centering larger amounts of clay is no easy feat. And with each video I make like this, I learn just as much from watching the footage back as I self-analyse all my movements. That's all for this week. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.